Before we start in the room, there is no scarcity of information or news anymore, and I think also a lot of people in this audience has been treating that like a threat. But isn't it rather an opportunity, because there's a lack of filtration and mediation, and that they have to deliver to their audience? Can they use it as an opportunity rather?
There is an opportunity here, and it is an enormous opportunity, but it isn't, I think, just old practice updated. It really means, I think, a new kind of attitude, because, as you say, delivering the basic information, people can find out what's going on to the degree that it's an event, lots and lots of ways. Only some of them are traditional media. I'll take a particular example that bugs me right now. In the United States, at least, we have had unbelievably bad coverage of the Greek bailout, the Greek banking crisis, because Greece can't pay its debts, and either it defaults on its debts or France and Germany pay, and either it gets kicked out of the EU in whole or in part, or it gives up some sovereignty to Brussels, right? That's the story. And yet you wouldn't know that from reading the American press. Oh, Sarkozy said this to Merkel or whatever, on, and they never say Greece can't pay. It's either going to default or France and Germany are going to pick it up, and it's either going to get kicked out or it's going to lose sovereignty inside. And if every news story had opened with that paragraph, today's events make a default more likely or less likely, whatever, people would understand 10 times more about that event at a 10th the space. And what it means is that what's become really important in an era where information is available in unlimited quantities is narrative, right? The ability to tell a story and to keep people focused on the main points of the story. And particularly for the daily news media, so much has been about the events of the day, this just happened, that I think a lot of the traditional media have lost sight of the fact that they are in a better position to tell the story, which is really, human beings don't consume facts, we consume stories. And I think that shift to a more explanatory demand, or basically to demand better explanations from the press, would go a long way towards making the glut of information an opportunity, as you say, instead of a threat.
But doesn't that show us a problem that there's that wouldn't be solved by new media or participatory journalism, because there's no one else writing about Greece in the US?
Well, there is. I mean, there are lots of people writing about Greece, but what's striking to me is that the people whose business is covering the news are doing such a bad job of explaining it. But I think the larger point is, you know, the reason I started with the Anisha Susan story, and the reason I said over and over again about there's no dividing line between old and new media anymore, is that this is not a place where, if all of the traditional media were to go away and we were just left with what we've got now, we would not be better off. And that is, I think that makes particularly journalism special, right? When you look at the music industry, right, the range and variability of ways that we can get to music, consume music, share music, the range of music we have access to, unbelievably much better than when I was growing up. And just an almost wholesale upgrade for anyone who loves music in terms of what we're able to do in this environment. Journalism will not be like that. In part because the one thing that professional journalists do really well that the bloggers don't do is they stay on top of really boring stories, right? It's not the exciting investigative stuff or, oh, I got a picture of the plane in the Hudson. People with phones in their pockets will do fine for that. It's the people who go down again today to City Hall to make sure that the mayor isn't corrupt. The people who have a daily police beat just to watch the police. And so in this case, I think it is going to be the hybridization of traditional capabilities and new capabilities that we should be hoping for, precisely because there's, my topic sentence for the last couple of years has been, markets produce less news than democracy demands. And if we just leave it to individual motivations, we'll get a lot of great event reporting, but this business of the civically hard and frankly boring stuff that is a capability that right now only the traditional outlets have, and that we need to figure out some way to integrate into the new environment.
So what you're saying is that actually investigative journalism will not suffer if you let your audience in and help you with doing other kinds of journalism?
No, and in fact, on the contrary, one of the things we've seen is that the hybridization of investigative journalism with audience observation, prior to the phone hacking, the minister's expense scandal was probably the biggest investigative journalism done in the UK in this decade. And it wouldn't have been possible if people hadn't been combing through those files. And there were different ways of doing it, but the Guardian's way of involving the audience allowed them to do better investigative journalism as a result.
But we have different motivation, because you talk about this cognitive surplus and comparing making the Wikipedia with watching television or television commercials. And we all want that. We've been talking about that for years. We really want our readers to contribute. But how can we make them, and what motivates them to contribute the way we want them to contribute?
Well, you can't make them. And there is no more robust finding in the entire history of social media than that users do not behave the way you want them to. And I mean that really seriously. And not just do they not behave the way you want them to because humans are unpredictable and variable and so forth, but also they don't behave the way you want them to because if they sense that you're trying to make them do something, they will act out in exactly the manner of small children. Right? Because small children get when you're overparenting is when you get the I'm not doing that. So the real shift in culture, and this is what I was talking about at the end, the real shift in culture is saying the people whose participation we want are not unpaid employees. If we treat them like unpaid employees, they will behave like unpaid employees, which is to say they will do nothing. But if we say, you and we have a shared interest in this, we will provide a platform in which we give you certain freedoms and we give you certain guarantees, then you can get enormous participatory rewards. And so there has been any number of experiments where people say, oh, we just put this out there and we asked people to help, and they didn't help. But I think as with the Guardian's discovery of the menu bar, if you do things that say not just we want you to kick in your labor for free, but this is a kind of shared project that we're all committing to together, then you can get better results. The example I used from Here Comes Everybody was Wikipedia, which obviously most important reference, most widely used reference work in the world. Microsoft saw that when they ran a competing encyclopedia project called Expedia. No, I'm sorry, not Expedia, but Encarta, thank you. All of their e-products. Encarta, which was Microsoft's online encyclopedia, and they said, oh, well, if people want to make the encyclopedia better, here's a form to do that. And by submitting this form, you're agreeing to this legal document, which says that everything you do will be owned by Microsoft in perpetuity for all media now and forever throughout the universe. And no one did it. What a surprise. Because it wasn't just about can you contribute to make the encyclopedia better. It was, are the people on the other end of the wire recognizing your contribution as something human and important, or are they just treating you as unpaid labor?
And using encyclopedia as an example, I recently heard someone say that change comes slower than we actually expect it to, but when it comes, it's total. And we saw the same thing with the encyclopedia, that they tried to have a paper version but had some things on the internet. But when we saw the change coming, the paper versions, how many has a paper version of encyclopedia in their house?
Correct. Yeah, I mean it's...
Okay, you inherited some.
Right.
But you say that you kind of say that the outcome of the invitation depends on the design of the invitation. So how we actually ask our readers to help us will give us the answer. So just opening up for comments under editorial articles, that's not a very good idea.
Well, in fact, I mean, I'll pick YouTube as the kind of, official worst source of comments in the history of the internet, and that is a low bar. When you look at YouTube, I think it becomes clear what's going on with comments. And comments in particular, as I sort of mentioned in the talk as well, are this really complicated issue. What media outlets want with comments is they want three things. They want high quality comments, they want large scale audience, and they want low cost of management. And the problem is, pick two. You can't get all three of those things at the same time. So although they say, oh gosh, we'd love high quality comments, we'd love the users to be coming in with all of this kind of engaged political commentary, the thing they say is, oh, but for the largest possible audience, because we're driving ad revenue, and we don't have money to pay anybody to police this. So if you commit yourself to scale above all, you're saying, first of all, we are trading off quality and cost. And if you commit yourself to high scale and low cost, you're saying, actually, quality is job three. And so what we see on the net is, if you look at sites like, say, Crooked Timber, which is a social science weblog, or Gödel's Lost Theorem, which is a site for discussing computer science, unbelievably useful, sophisticated, erudite commentary among people who care passionately about their fields and know each other, right? But the thing that makes those places good is that they have a small audience and a high commitment to moderation. Right now, a lot of what's happening is newspapers are saying, well, the 100,000 of you go in and talk about this and we'll see what you come up with. We're not going to do anything to police it, right? And it turns into Lord of the Flies. But it always does. We've always known that. So in a way, what I think the current getting worked up about comments thing indicates more than anything is nobody's paying attention to the history of the medium so far. And we actually have a bunch of really good ways of getting comment threads to be good. They're just not ways that are easy if you're already committed to cheapness and scale.
Lord of the Flies, I know that you're here. VG, Aftenposten, Dagbladet. You're making notes, right? Good. Okay. We have a question in the audience, but I saw a phrase from you. Institutions will try to preserve the problem to which they are a solution, as the Shirky principle. It's great when you can have principles named after.
Yeah, I did not call it that. That was Kevin Kelly. I hasten to add.
But do you see media as such institutions?
Well, I'll give you an example from the media environment. The recording industry used to be in the business of making music more abundant. Right? That used to be their business model, right? Because if they didn't press records or they didn't press CDs, it was harder to get music, and after they'd done their job, it was easier to get music. So the music industry made music more, or the recording industry rather, made music more abundant. And then the internet comes along, and it solves the problem of abundance at a scale and at a cost that blows everything previously out of the water. And the recording industry's business model suddenly becomes creating and managing scarcity. They don't say, we're the people who want to distribute music, because if they had been those people, they'd have built iTunes themselves, right? They said, we're going to do everything in our power to take our old business model, making music more abundant, and completely reversing it to make music less abundant so that we can maintain our old way of doing business. And you see this over and over again. When there comes a new solution to a set of problems, institutions whose culture says we're here to solve those problems, but whose actual construction is we're here to manage those problems, will actually work to keep those problems around, even in completely artificial ways.
Okay, I think it was Siren.
Yes, Siren Henschen from the national commercial TV station,
hey.
TV2. You present a shift of culture, and you've given examples of how that new culture affects political balance. I want to ask you, do you also see other shifts in balance when it comes to gender? You mentioned the example from India, but do you see representation of the different sexes being changed in the new culture?
So yes. The good news, I think, is there is an increase in female participation generally. The bad news is the increase is still strongly constrained by the things that constrained it previously. So I'll give you an example of each of those two things. It has been widely, to the point of almost universally remarked upon, that the events of the Arab Spring have been characterized by far more female participation in the protests and in political speech than have happened previously in the region, and that even in areas that have almost complete control over their public political speech, like Saudi Arabia, it is the women whose protests have achieved, in a way, the most significant results. This was true even in Iran. The Green Wave was kind of the prototype for a lot of the current Arab uprisings, and yet the most successful political campaign in Iran was the Million Signatures movement, which got women lobbying the Iranian parliament not to make polygamy easier. So these tools, in the same way that books allowed women to read in private and increased the possibility of female education, these tools increase the possibility of female public speech and female coordinated action. That having been said, they are still tools that are implemented in a particular culture. For my money, Esther Hargitay, who's a researcher at Northwestern, has done the best work on this. And what she has said is there is a strong correlation between participation in use of participatory media and educational attainment of the parents and gender. So the gender split online is better, but it is not yet even. And that, I think, tells us where the next bit of work is. That when we look particularly to these political uprisings and we see increased female participation, that ways of making it, particularly in the democratic world, ways of making it easier for women to register political views in public speech should be an explicit goal. In fact, one of the things I think that has to be policed in comment sections, to the degree that there's sort of moderation and rules, is preventing male commenters from attacking female commenters for the crime of thinking while female, which is still, a common enough pattern that I think it needs to be addressed.
And we have another one over here, and at the first table here.
Thank you. Carl Nicolai from Schibsted Media Group. You mentioned the topic that of democracy and democratization of news. And we see a movement of democratization of news brought forward by citizen journalism, social networks, and other mobile services. And then adding to that, in particular, the mobile phone. Coupled with the fact that smartphones will soon, and somewhere already is, a commodity tool that everyone will own. What will be, or what could be, the role of news organizations on a smaller and different platform, as the mobile phone is?
Certainly right now we're seeing people experimenting with with production and consumption, kind of at the edges of the network. So I've got an app that brings me down the news, and now, as you saw with the BBC thing, this thing that happened a couple of days ago, I've got an app that helps me, produce a photo and annotate it or whatever. I think what's coming is what's coming in the middle, which is not at either end of the chain, but rather ways of involving the citizens essentially in the news ecosystem, in the middle of producing the news. There is a lot of work now on mobile phones for crowdsourcing translations, for example. One of the huge effects that we need to overcome if we're going to get a more globally aware news environment is quick translation of things in and out of languages. And there's a group called Crowdflower that took SMSs and phone calls out of the Haitian disaster after there was that awful earthquake in Port-au-Prince. And there was a group of Haitian cab drivers in Boston, good Haitian English translators, good essentially bilingual speakers, who were given an application on their phones that said, I can be in the middle of this news story, taking the Haitian stuff in and putting the English stuff out so that the Red Cross and other rescue organizations can put these reports on a map. And I think that middle part is the model of news that's still largely unexplored, which is what happens when we actually get group participation around processing the story, not just either gathering the raw material or distributing the finished product. And most of that is still to come, but I think we've seen some sort of tantalizing examples of it.
Then we have Anders.
Anders from NRK Bita.
Hey, Anders.
We talked about it a bit earlier today. The penetration of Facebook. What does that actually mean in the large scale?
Yeah.
And when
So
time
Facebook is, it's funny. Anders and I were actually talking about this earlier today. Facebook, even when I wrote Cognitive Surplus, which was largely in 2009, it was still possible to imagine that Facebook could be disciplined by the market. That in the same way that 6 Degrees was replaced by Friendster, which was replaced by MySpace, which was replaced by Facebook as the kind of most prominent social network, it was possible to imagine that something else could come along and do that again if Facebook got to essentially started reneging on promises to its users. And I now don't think that anymore. I don't think that Facebook can be disciplined by the market. I think it is so big that it has effectively become a utility, not just a service. The value of this is that it is, in a way, the first truly global medium that people are, in an almost literal way, connected in that 6 degrees of separation network from here to Botswana. The downside of that is that we don't have a public sphere. We have a corporate sphere that tolerates public speech. And the degree to which the management decisions of a single company affect a global medium with significant political consequences for conversation makes me nervous, not as a customer or a consumer of Facebook, but as a citizen of the democratic world and someone who aspires to see democracy spread more widely than it is. I don't know what the answer to that is. In the United States, we have less of a tradition of regulating media companies around these kinds of issues than exist in Europe. But if Facebook can't be disciplined by the market, then effectively government regulation is what's coming. I think Germany has already kicked this off around privacy. But even if it's hard to articulate the solution, I think the problem is pretty clear, which is Facebook is irreplaceably, unthreatenably important, and because it's committed to the advertising market, its commitment to freedom of speech is not as core to its set of values as with the rise of newspapers, which also had to bridge this commercial and public function, but which had a much greater commitment to the public side of the house.
Well, they said that Titanic couldn't sink either.
Yes. Well, no, I could be wrong. And look, if I'm wrong, this would be happy news, because in a way, the threat of another company displacing something like Facebook would keep Facebook essentially more attentive to its users. But I think 2 years ago I would have said exactly that Titanic line, but I don't see how a competitor could emerge. And that's new, and not just around commercial companies in our little end of the 21st century. That is new in the history of the internet.
Very interesting. We have one over here and then another one there.
Okay, Frederick here from Gothenburg University.
Hi,
my question relates very much to that we were talking about here, which is the identity we have and present at the prism of being online, both the privacy issue and what we share, and the relations to operating systems of the internet as we see it now merging with the Facebook space. And I think you reflected upon that as well, where we get worried about the ownership of our own identity in those spaces, and we are seeing different newcomers like Diaspora and Unthink and other means to take back our identity. And I think you're right. So what's your quest for the identity 2.0, if you will, where you have the opportunity to fine-tune in a simpler way your presence in different spaces?
Right. So I'm afraid that fine-tuning your presence in different spaces is not going to be simpler. In fact, the simplest thing we can imagine is everybody has one identity and uses it all the time. And at one point, Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook went out and said, I don't get all this business about having different identities. There's just one you. Why don't you be you in the same place, right? And only a straight white man in a culture that rewards straight white men could ask that question in a rhetorical way, right? for almost anyone, there is some aspect of their identity which is kept away from the public sphere, and that has been true, at least for as long as there has been what we call the modern world. Right, the idea of private reading led to this kind of encapsulation of our thoughts and hopes and dreams as separate from our public presentation in the market. As much as Diaspora in particular is a project that came out of NYU, and as much as I appreciate those projects, I don't believe that a protest movement model for getting away from Facebook can succeed in this environment, which is to say, I think the weight of the default means we are left with managing Facebook rather than adopting these alternatives. The two things I think can happen are, one, the maintenance of a robust set of alternatives outside Facebook for topic-specific conversations. When you look at, for example, I mentioned earlier this computer science weblog, Goethe's Lost Letter, irreplaceably important in computational mathematics. It was the place where last summer's proposed proof of the most important problem in that field was hashed out by all of the relevant members. Can't really do that on Facebook right now. So one, we need to maintain those kinds of places, but two, we need to fight like hell against anybody who says, must use your real name in all circumstances. I think we have the example of the Arab Spring before us as to what happens when you give people's real names. There are plenty of examples of places where minorities are persecuted or where points of view are persecuted that where you want people to be able to express themselves without coming under that threat. And Google in particular has been an especially bad actor on that subject around Google+, around their recent social network, which moved to a default real names policy. They've now announced that they're moving away from that, although we don't yet know the mechanism. My fear is that they're going to say, you must give us your real name, but then you can use a pseudonym in public, which is not much protection when the authorities come knocking. But the single most important thing, I think, is not to fantasize about an alternative to Facebook, but to say instead, we're going to fight to preserve in the network we have the ability of people to make even expressions we don't like publicly available in a political sphere that doesn't subject them to deadly threat.
It's still important to be able to be anonymous on the internet.
It is important. It's not, there are obviously also problems with it. It is certainly by no means an easy balance for organizations to take, for society to take, which is to say, pure unfettered anonymity without any means for the authorities to pierce the veil is also a profound risk. But what we've consistently seen, and it's the most worrying thing, is that when democracies get hold of those tools, even under the explanation of national security, they use them for all kinds of other stuff. There was an amazing graph about what's happened in the United States since the September 11th attacks of 2001 in terms of civil liberties. A whole new set of tools was put into law enforcement's hands for warrantless spying on citizens. And there was a graph of number of times this capability has been used around terrorist acts, number of times it's been used around the war on drugs. And the casual use of this violation of civil liberties to pursue the war on drugs crimes so wildly outstrips the rationale for the original power that even when we say the state should have the power to pierce the veil of anonymity, we also have to work incredibly hard to keep that from becoming a general purpose low-cost tool.
But we don't believe that about the Norwegian government, do we? So
that I don't have standing to say. I don't vote here, so I don't get to say.
We have one question over here, and then we have here.
Yeah, hi. I'm Helge Høybråten. I just want to go back to Wikipedia because that has totally destroyed an encyclopedia business by providing the most accessible, comprehensive, best updated, and pretty reliable compared to traditional encyclopedias product out there. So it killed off a business, a traditional solid business worldwide more or less. And why or why not should the same happen to news media?
Right. So here's why. We have confused two different things, I think, because they've traveled together for so long that they were the same. One is what Asa Briggs, the great British historian of media, calls the comfortable logic of scarcity, right? The advertising market that's built around scarce functions like the printing press. And the other is having somebody go down to City Hall again today to make sure that the mayor's office is not corrupt. And because that came in the same printed package, we thought all that stuff went together. But when you go into the newsroom, what you see is that people are writing about football so they can take money from a car company and then pay the guy who's going down to look at the mayor's office, right? The people who are covering the politicians and the police, they're subsidized. They're not actually providing the service that's being paid for. They're providing the service that's essential to democracy. And newspapers have been this weird bundle of, here's your horoscope and maybe some coupons, and oh, by the way, the mayor should be in jail, that we think that it's all the same thing. But what I worry about when I look at the news media is not about whether or not people will have a place to see nice pictures of cars. I think that is a solved problem. And I don't worry about whether or not people can get news about celebrities or their horoscope or sports, but I do worry about just the day-to-day part of City Hall. So rather than saying, why shouldn't the newspapers go out of business, which some of them have done and more of them will do, what I worry instead is we used to have this way of subsidizing this critically important social function, and we'd better find a new way, because the old way of taking money from the car companies because they wanted to advertise to people who care about soccer isn't working anymore. I was just talking backstage earlier about a proposal in Denmark, and I can only characterize it for you because I've only just learned about it, that says, we will give you state subsidy in a content and platform neutral way if you have A, more than 5 reporters, and B, in proportion to the number of reporters that are doing this kind of news, civically important news. I can't imagine us ever doing anything like that in the States. We have a very different bias for a whole bunch of historical reasons. But that seems like an interesting way to take on this problem. Now, one of the sources of subsidy is give the journalists more leverage by giving them access to good crowdsourcing tools. But it isn't the commercial parts of the newspapers that I'm worried about going away. It's really this public function that's been situated in a commercial entity but was never really the commercial bit in the first place. And that, I think, makes it different from the encyclopedia market, where the alignment between the commercial and the production imperatives were basically like that. Newspapers are a commercial entity kind of wrapping this civic core. And even if we throw away the wrapper, I think we have to care about the core.
But wouldn't you rather suggest crowdfunding, like Spot
Us, yeah.
rather
David's
than moving, subsidies from the people who's interested in sports?
I keep going back to boring, right? No, seriously, that is the hard problem. If you look at, and David Cohn's project Spot Us, if you haven't seen it, spot.us, is crowdfunding specifically for news. Give me money to do this story. And there are documentarians who do something similar on Kickstarter and the other various crowdfunding tools. But they're all exciting, right? They're all, I want to go to Libya because I know people there and I speak Arabic, and if I'm on the ground with a camera, it will be really interesting. Okay, great, get on the plane, go, here's some money. If I wanted to Spot Us and said, you know what, I'm going to go down to City Hall and I'm going to look through the old real estate records, would you pay me to do that for months and months? No, that is not a great Spot Us campaign, right? I'm not going to have videos of me leafing through the real estate records, but that, I'm not seeing Bambuser, right, as the kind of centerpiece of this. So it's the boring part, right? We've got great ways of getting photos of breaking events, video of breaking events, all of that stuff, but it's the people who just pay attention to the daily working of the government that I think doesn't show up well in the crowdfunding model.
But shouldn't we just open up government?
Sorry, could I just comment?
Sure.
That's a really funny. So just concerning going down to City Hall, it's really funny because it just came out the news in the Mirror that the Sussex police force in the UK are going to start streaming live during the daily activities. So, I mean, they're trying to in some way take that over as well.
Right. So that the police beat can be everybody. I mean, if you've got people on the production side of news willing to be transparent, that is another way that this function can be subsidized. And it's fantastic that the police force is doing it. I have a hard time imagining that, say, the mafia would adopt a similar strategy.
But that would, I mean, in that sense, the mafia would be much more fun to look at. I mean, the police force is pretty boring.
The mafia, sadly, also super boring. I mean, what you see on TV are the highlights, right? I mean, it's. But there are organizations, whether they're businesses or governments or crime syndicates, whatever, that commit themselves to obscuring their business from the public. And it's wonderful that a police force doesn't. And I think that pushing for that kind of transparency lowers the cost of accountability across society. But as long as there are conspiracies, there need to be people paid to watch out for them. And that, I think, doesn't show up in the crowdfunding model, which is more event and story, individual story driven than it is daily long-term pressure. And it's daily long-term pressure that turns out to be the hard thing to fund.
Okay, I'll buy you a beer and we can talk about that later.
Very good.
Gentleman in the middle of the room there, and that's the last question I have from the room. So when he speaks, raise your hand if you have any questions, or that will be the last question, please.
There's another one over here.
Good.
Hi, Jens Kelsen from the University of Bergen. I would like you to elaborate a little bit on the future of public broadcasting. You had an interesting example.
I'm sorry, the future of?
Public broadcasting.
Public broadcasting. Oh, yes.
Thank you. You had an interesting example with the BBC. And I know we're not allowed to do comments, but I would really like to hear what the people here from the NRK thinks. Because you changed the line, but I wouldn't have just changed the line. I would have carved out the BBC as the odd one out. And you said that the BBC and the Times were now treating everyone as the same. They were treating everyone as consumers and content as products in this manner.
Well, so the first thing I'll say about the BBC, the everyone is the same reference wasn't so much to the user base as to the source of funds. So that comparison was really about the British taxpayers funding the BBC rather than the British as users of it. In terms of the consumers and the product, I've seen the BBC make a number of decisions that were enormously disappointing from the standpoint of news as service and from users. For instance, the whole iPlayer debate in the BBC about how open or locked down should the video content be. That they've consistently moved against remix, reuse, rebroadcast in favor of something that is a relatively as straightforward a recapitulation of broadcast as you can get on the internet. And there are certainly people inside the BBC who are committed to a much more, news as service model. But their successes seem to me to be relatively partial, rather than something that's platform-wide. The question, I think, is really how much does any given public broadcaster regard reuse of their product as a core part of their goal? And to the degree that it shows up in a format and with a license that allows for or encourages reuse, that tips the scale towards a service. To the degree that it shows up with standard kind of lockdown copyright or in players that don't allow people to get the content and work with it, it shows up in news as product. And I think I put them on the screen as a kind of dichotomy just to show the big, where I would draw the line. But in fact, it's a spectrum, and I think you could look at any given decision around how much space is there for participation, how much space is there for people to take this content, show it to their friends, remix it, etc. And not just on a service-by-service basis, but really on a show-by-show basis. Say, does this show assume that the readers or viewers or listeners are going to do more than consume with it? And one of the things we know, I mean, The Guardian commissioned this study a few years ago. They said, other things being equal, newspaper stories that have comments get more readers than newspaper stories that don't have comments. So this isn't even, oh, you need to adopt this new participatory model in tension with your old business of driving use in advertising. In many cases, the participation is the thing that drives the use, and in the public model, the participation is, the sense of community is the thing that drives the donations. But that's what I'd look for when I'm talking about sort of product and service, consumer and user. It really is around the very practical choices around delivery, licensing, retweetability, if that's a word, but that ability to behave as someone who can comment on, synthesize, add some sort of opinion to a piece, and then forward it on. To the degree that that's true, you're in the user and service model. To the degree that that's false, you're in the kind of platform and consumer model.
Okay, so I have three more questions, and that's it. And they're all on the front row. First one here, and then the second one here.
Okay, this is Frederick again.
And then that one.
My complementary question here is within another space. You're talking about the participatory changes where we actually engage with either with clients or customers or listeners, or in my case where I've been looking into healthcare system where we as patients are engaging in our well-being. And how that could change, the way we run healthcare. And I'm curious about, do you think the government and the leadership is actually attentive enough to take care of all that big data?
Are you asking about my country or yours?
Or any country.
My country, no. The very idea that everyone in the country would have health insurance has almost broken our political system. So in the U.S. context, it's kind of an extraordinary conversation. So the question around big data is very much like the comfortable logic of scarcity around media, which is to say there are a set of people who are quite comfortable with the kind of, we have your data and we will give it to you when and as we think it's useful to you, right? This has been the sort of historic doctor-patient model. But what we see over and over again is that humans, if you give them data in a way that makes sense to them, not here's a raw dump of something that looks like a mainframe threw up, but here's a chart or a graph of your insulin levels. People flock to that in droves. And the big cultural gap, to take the analogous, with the slide I ended for, the analogous cultural gap in the medical industry is, do doctors believe that their patients want to see their own data? And to a first approximation, doctors who don't believe that don't understand what's happening, especially with their younger patients. A former student of mine invented a service called Foursquare that is a check-in service for when you go out, when you go out at night. I was at this bar, I was at that restaurant. And you get these gorgeous charts and graphs of your social life. It's like you've got an annual report of your social life. And I show this to doctors and I say, a 25-year-old who in your care probably has better information about their drinking habits than they do about their medication, right? And once you see it that way, once you see that there's this hunger for people to get essentially data that tells them a story about themselves, you can see the incredible value in this big data that can be unleashed. But then the issue becomes exactly the one you've raised, which is there the political will there to say we're going to give to the individuals something that's valuable to them, even if it disrupts the culture of the medical industry as we've been used to it? And I'm sure the answer is going to be yes in some places, no in others, and then we'll look to the countries that do it best and we'll see what we learn.
Okay, last question here. If you just give the microphone to the next table. Thank you.
My name is Chris Black with VizRT. My question
That's not a Norwegian accent.
No, it's not a Norwegian accent. I just moved here. And my question has to do more with a generational or society shift upon what we see with these social networks and, of course, social tools. And actually, in particular, I'm talking about colleges and educational institutions. When you look at Wikipedia, let's say if you want to do a report on Henry VIII, it's not acceptable to get your information from Wikipedia. Even though you have a large number of people that are contributing to this online encyclopedia, you still have to go back to your classic encyclopedias or find other references to get that information. At the same time, you look at news, you can get news from all these different sites. What is actually a acceptable reference for news? Is it acceptable to say this happened because I saw a photo of it on Facebook versus seeing it on CNN? And then, of course, you get into the other news that may be state-funded, et cetera. And I'm just wondering what you think about that.
You know, so first of all, the Academy has this, you know, preserving the problem to which they are the solution. Our version of that in the Academy is making sure it's really hard to find out facts. Right? So it's not unacceptable to use Wikipedia to start your research. In fact, almost everybody does that all the time. It's just unacceptable to admit that that's what you did. And so what people do is they go to Wikipedia and they read the article and they say, okay, I get it. And then they go to the bottom where the links are and they go to those links and they cite the links. So Wikipedia provides the service, but you just can't, right? You can't admit that that's the case. The news question is really interesting, particularly in a US context. The news business is the one business where it is unconstitutional to lock out innovation. Our First Amendment makes it illegal to have certified news gathering. So the news people have been going on for years about, we should make sure and have a professional organization with certification so that ordinary people can't say that they're reporting the news. And because that turns out to be unconstitutional, they've never been able to do it. What we see instead is now concern for reliability coming to the fore instead of concern for whether or not there's a kind of a news stamp or a news badge. And we're seeing the usual cat and mouse game of once people have realized that shutting down, once in particular authoritarian regimes have realized shutting down the network turns out to be a bad move, as Mubarak discovered. Now they're sending people out to flood Twitter or Facebook with propaganda. And so now we're in the cat and mouse game part of this of how do you figure out when any given message is state propaganda versus when it's, you know, something really reported by a citizen in the field. Right now, the authoritarian regimes tend to be incredibly inept about it. All these eggs show up on Twitter, the people who don't have any photos, they have only one follow, or they're only following one other person, and every single thing they say is sort of pro-Bahraini regime. That's a relatively easy one to find out. But over the long term, we're going to need better ways of sorting this is likely from this is unlikely to be true. Eric Hirschman, one of the co-founders of Ushahidi, the crowd mapping service, has started a project that he calls Swift River about what kinds of signals can you get when you're getting tons of SMSs in about an event, whether it's an earthquake or a political uprising or whatever. And you're getting tons of information in. What can you do to sort the good stuff from the bad stuff in near real time? And that, I mean, to the earlier question of sort of what difference do mobile phones make, that is going to be another one of these tools, right? That we just got a report in, we'll send a message out to everybody whose mobile phone is near that lat long saying, we hear there's a fire here, can you corroborate? Because that kind of fact-checking hasn't been such a big deal so far because the only people who participate in the news environment have been people who really want to send real news. But as people have started to realize you could sway public opinion if you could inject ersatz material into these networks, now we're going to start to need the fact-checking piece of these applications that we haven't needed before.
Thank you. I just had a look at Twitter while you were speaking now, and I think, well, one thing that we can summarize is that we're all scared of Facebook now. And I'm guessing those tweets actually are automated into your Facebook lines as well, so Facebook now knows that you're scared of them. And that boring journalism will save journalism.
Boring journalism will say. I wouldn't have put it exactly that way, but I suppose if that may be a useful tagline. I mean, it is the one irreplaceable function, right? Is to have an institution with an infinite time horizon, saying to society's other powerful institutions, whether they're businesses or governments or religions or whatever, we're here and we're watching.
You know, you have to leave them with some hope.
Go be boring and everything will be fine. No, that's not actually maybe the good.
And lastly, if we give Clay Shirky a wig, we would be sitting here listening to Tom Hanks. Thank you so much.
Thank you for coming out. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.